Rejected by the electorate, the Conservative Party suffers its worst defeat in decades in the UK general election. Labour is taking power, promising change. But is it a watershed moment in UK politics, and how will it shape the way the country is governed? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. The UK has a new Prime Minister. Keir Starmer has led the Labour Party to a landslide election victory, its first win in more than a decade. But has the electorate truly embraced Labour? Or was this also a vote against the Conservatives? And with third parties on the rise, is UK politics changing shape? We'll go to our panel in just a few moments' time. But first, Fintan Monaghan has this report.
A landslide victory for Labour after 14 years on the outside. Keir Starmer shifted his party towards the centre, a strategy that's helped him become the UK's new Prime Minister.
With respect and humility, I invite you all to join this government of service in the mission of national renewal. Our work is urgent, and we begin it today.
Outgoing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was the fourth Conservative to hold the post in 6 years. Many blame this leadership instability for the party's defeat.
I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
The election also saw the rise of the anti-immigration party Reform UK. Its leader, right-wing populist Nigel Farage, secured a seat in Parliament along with several others. Many of his supporters are former Conservative voters who believe the party failed to deliver on its promises of immigration reform.
We are going to come second in hundreds of constituencies. How many seats we're going to win, I don't know. But to have done this in such a short space of time says something very fundamental is happening.
Starmer faces many challenges. He's promised to grow the economy and improve living standards, revamp public services, especially the struggling healthcare system, and resolve the housing crisis. Starmer's clear majority ensures he'll have near free rein to push through his party's policies in the House of Commons. But one thing's for sure, those who voted for Labour will expect results, and soon. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in our guests. Joining me from London is former Labour Party candidate for Gloucester, Fran Boait. From Clophill in Bedfordshire, I'm joined by Leon Emirali, a political commentator and former aide to UK Cabinet Minister Steve Barclay. And also in London is Henry Newman, a former senior advisor to Boris Johnson and Conservative MP Michael Gove. A very warm welcome to all of you. A very warm welcome to Inside Story on this historic moment, of course, in British politics. Fran, I wonder if I can start by addressing you. Keir Starmer becomes the first person to take his party from opposition into power in 27 years. No small feat. He stood on the steps of Downing Street and he's talked about the need to unify the country. But who is Keir Starmer? A man who has flirted with both the left and the centre of his own party. He's worked under the likes of Jeremy Corbyn before fiercely distancing himself from him. He's now played the centre ground to rebrand the party. Apart from winning, what does he stand for, Fran?
Well, I guess we're about to find out. I mean, it is a huge majority and a huge achievement. And at the same time, it's clear, from across the political spectrum that people and the country is crying out for change, having had 15 years of declining living standards, obliteration of our public services. And the big question is how fast can Labour deliver change and how far will they go? Because it's not clear from the manifesto that what they're offering in terms of economic change is going to be what the country and people that voted yesterday are asking for. So I think that's the real question. You know, we've got 1 in 4 households who can't afford the living essentials. We've got skyrocketing child poverty. We've got crumbling public services, whether that's Thames Water, whether that's our public transport or NHS education. And from across the political spectrum, we have seen Starmer's economic policy under Rachel Reeves, who's now the Chancellor, criticised for not being bold enough when people are actually asking to be taxed higher, to implement wealth taxes, and for those things to be funding public services. They have, very deliberately undercommitted. And yet, as you said in the clip, is that people do want to see some change quite quickly because living standards have declined for so long. So that's the real challenge that this incoming government faces, and we'll see, what they are able to deliver in the first 100 days. They promised the New Deal for working people. That was watered down, and the unions criticised that being watered down, but it's still there, and it's been promised to be delivered. Will that make an impact and kind of set the stage for really improving people's living standards? The bottom 20% have had 15 years of decline. Are they going to be able to go fast enough, and are they going to go far enough?
Henry, Fran mentioned Rachel Reeves there. She's going to be the most second powerful person in government, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister, for those who may not know what that exactly means. She has talked repeatedly of, quote, secure economics. Fran isn't too sure that there will be a massive economic change to the way in which Labour run the country. But what does the fact that they've put that as a priority say about people's hopes and fears in the country at the moment?
Well, I thought the most interesting thing Fran said was at the very beginning. She said, we'll find out what Keir Starmer is actually going to do as Prime Minister. I don't think we really know. I think in this election, we've seen the Conservative Party decisively ejected by the electorate. I don't think it's a massive surprise. Certainly it's what all the polls were suggesting for quite a long time. The Labour Party's strategy through this election has been to kind of walk with a Ming vase held tightly between their two hands across a slippery floor. Their intention was not to trip up, not to slip, and not to let that vase drop. And they've succeeded. But it's a quite extraordinary result in lots of ways. Of course, it's historic, but the Labour Party's vote share is significantly below where the Conservatives were in 2019. Under the UK system, that has given them a very big majority, a historic majority, as I said. We also saw some extraordinary losses on the Conservative side with former Prime Minister, albeit briefly, Liz Truss losing her seat in Norfolk, along with a host of different cabinet ministers. But as you said now, the question turns to what will the future Labour government do? Who will Keir Starmer put into the key positions? We suspect that Rachel Reeves will obviously become the first female finance minister in UK history. She's in some respects, an impressive person, but I don't think we've really understood much of what she wants to achieve. She talked about secure economics in, I thought, quite a dull lecture she gave some time ago. But I think the Labour Party might be happy with a relatively dull approach to managing the public finances. I might think that they've tried to argue this, that change would be an effective way of transforming the country. That essentially their argument is stability is change. And I think it's fair enough to say that the country has been looking for a bit more stability over the last few years.
Leon, let's throw that to you. Is dullness the key to Labour's success? I mean, Labour's managed to get this big majority without really saying a huge amount about what they're going to do, apart from what we've heard from Starmer on the steps of Downing Street a little bit earlier on. Can you shed some more light on, firstly, this so-called Ming vase strategy that Henry talked about, and what we anticipate Starmer to do?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to note is that this is not necessarily Labour's victory as much as it is the Conservatives' defeat. And I think what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have done is played an incredibly efficient campaign where they have won in the seats they needed to win in to deliver this huge majority without necessarily having a huge share of the votes. And I think that is incredibly smart. But it also is an indictment on the last 14 years of Conservative government. It is ultimately a rejection of the Conservatives. It's not because Keir Starmer is this wildly popular leader in the way that maybe Tony Blair was in 1997. It is simply a yearning for change, which I think has delivered the result that we've seen. going back to the points made by both Fran and Henry, we know so little about Keir Starmer and what his government are going to do, because this has been a real sort of safety first election campaign from Labour and Keir Starmer. Ultimately, what he's been saying is we are just going to do things differently to the Conservatives. What that looks like in economic terms, in security and defence terms, in what it means for the public services, we've got very little detail. And I think the coming fortnight, the coming couple of months will be very telling, and we'll soon get a sense of whether Keir Starmer is going to change the country, or whether it might just be business as usual and trying to batten down the hatches and get Britain back on track. So we don't know a great deal about Starmer and his team, all to be revealed.
We do know about Fran. We do know about the impact that the party has had to pay in terms of the penalty it's had to pay because of its early response to Israel's war on Gaza. I mean, one prominent MP, Jonathan Ashworth, I mean, he was expected to join the new cabinet as Paymaster General. He lost to an independent who was particularly vocal on Gaza. Other Labour MPs have also seen their vote share decimated. Fran, remind us of what Labour got wrong here, why the party wasn't as vocal as perhaps it should have been.
Yes, I mean, we've seen Wes Streeting, who's only held on to a seat by, I think, just under 600 votes. So, this is a real key issue for the party, and people in their thousands have not voted for Labour, as they have probably done for a long time before then, because of Labour's hesitancy in taking months to come out in favour of a ceasefire in Gaza. And this has had real detrimental impacts. And I think there's also a kind of a wider question on how Labour is thinking about its foreign policy, and how that is really not aligned with huge numbers of their previous supporters, whether that's young people, whether that's minority ethnic groups. We're in 2024. We want to see a modern foreign policy. And actually, under Starmer, I think there's been huge disappointment across many different groups on their stance, and obviously taking way too long to come out in favour of a ceasefire.
And Henry, talking about foreign policy, I mean, you were former special advisor to Michael Gove, to Boris Johnson. I've seen images of you wearing a Get Brexit Done hat. I mean, it was very much at the forefront of your time at Number 10 as a special advisor. But, I mean, elephant in the room, who has actually mentioned Brexit at all? I didn't hear Starmer mention Brexit on the steps of Downing Street and in his acceptance speech. Why is that?
Well, I think in general, I don't think foreign policy is a major determining factor in most British elections. I think it's obviously true that in a number of seats, there was a kind of Gaza reaction. But I think if I was a Labour strategist today, I would think, well, we lost a few crucial seats. John Ashworth, as you mentioned, who was a shadow cabinet office minister, fell to an independent. But broadly, I think if I was a Labour strategist, I'd be pretty happy with our overall result today. So I wouldn't be sort of searching my soul on that grounds. I think to your broader question, the 2019 Conservative sort of coalition that was struck was a combination of different factors. I think there was a general fatigue with the Brexit paralysis that we'd seen in the UK since the referendum in 2016. We had Theresa May's premiership, which was unstable, especially once she lost her parliamentary majority in a 2017 snap election. And then it felt like the country could sort of neither take a step forward nor a step backwards. And I think there was, from almost all quarters of the electorate, just a desire to see an end to that and to get Brexit done, as Boris Johnson promised. And at the same time, there was a kind of a policy of levelling up, which was designed to speak to the need to improve the economic and other fortunes of different parts of the country. And I think that was successful in winning Boris Johnson what had been the largest Conservative majority since the Thatcher years. And I think if we're trying to look at what went wrong for the Conservative Party, it was partially abandoning that levelling up mission under Rishi Sunak. I think the policy continued, and indeed my former boss, Michael Gove, was responsible for quite a lot of significant progress there. But I don't think we spoke about it at all in the election. I don't think Rishi Sunak ever particularly made a big deal of it. He was much more keen to talk about the challenge of illegal migration and the small boat arrivals. But I don't think we particularly proclaimed the successes of the UK outside the European Union. And indeed, there'd been something of a sort of conspiracy of silence from both of the main parties on Brexit. I think even the Liberal Democrats, who are kind of the party, perhaps the mainstream national or cross-UK party, most likely to sort of want a rapprochement with Europe, were relatively quiet about Brexit compared to their previous elections. The Scottish Nationalist Party, which is obviously a party just in Scotland seeking Scottish independence, did speak more about Brexit, but I don't think that particularly helped their fortunes. And indeed, they fell back very significantly and now have been left with fewer than a dozen MPs.
Nevertheless, turning to you, Leon, what Starmer has said when it comes to relations with Europe is that the deal that we've agreed to under the Conservatives is a poor one, that a better arrangement can be reached. Do you think that that's possible, Leon?
It is possible. We've seen that, actually, from Rishi Sunak. The Windsor framework that he negotiated did seem to bring the UK slightly closer to Europe. And seem to be widely accepted by business community and others as a step in the right direction. I think what Keir Starmer now has to do is balance a very broad coalition of voters, where you've got those in the south and in urban areas who wanted to see the UK remain in the European Union from the outset. And then you've got the seats in the north of England, which are strongly Brexiteer seats that want to see the UK remain far away from Europe. And I think for Keir Starmer, he now has to juggle the priorities of that incredibly wide electoral coalition that he has built. I do think that ultimately reality is going to dictate that the UK will have to have a closer relationship with the European Union over time. And I think that we are likely to see that happen, more likely to see that happen under a Labour government than we would have done under a Conservative government because of the internal politics and the history within the two parties. But I think that could cost Keir Starmer a number of votes if that happens before the next election in 5 years' time. And that could be the thing that spells the beginning of the end for Keir Starmer. But we're getting ahead of ourselves discussing that at this point. I think ultimately what Starmer is going to do with a big mandate, with a big majority, is try and bring the country together, try and unite the country, draw a line under the division of Brexit that we saw in recent times in politics, and try and move the country forward with a close relationship with Europe, but not necessarily back into the fold in the EU that we were before Brexit.
All right, let's talk about some of the challenges of uniting the country shortly. But firstly, let me give some context to our viewers about precisely how the UK election works, because UK elections use what's called a first-past-the-post system. Voters choose their preferred candidate in their constituency, but there is no second round of voting. The candidate with the most votes wins. That can lead to outcomes where the percentage of the vote is significantly different to the number of seats a party wins. So, for example, Labour has won a large majority in Parliament with 412 seats, but only about 34% of the vote, while Reform UK got more than 14% of the vote, but only 4 seats. Fran, turning to you, because the UK's first-past-the-post system, Labour wins, as I mentioned there, with around 34% of the popular vote. I mean, compare that to Tony Blair back in 1997, where he gains just over around 43% of the vote. I mean, of course, this is a Labour landslide, isn't it? But there's a problem here when it comes to legitimacy, isn't there?
Yes, I mean, I think as one news commentator put it last night, it's a thumping majority, but without the thumping vote share. It's less than 2% higher than when the vote share Labour got in 2019, when obviously Boris Johnson led the Conservatives to a huge majority. And I think, we're seeing that this electoral system of first past the post isn't working for most voters across the country. There's also huge support for electoral reform, for a proportional representation system within the Labour Party membership. And so it's going to be interesting if we can see a kind of broad-based coalition from all the opposition parties, from the Greens to Reform, to push for electoral reform under this government, and whether they can bring across some of those Labour MPs who also want to see electoral reform. Because if, the way Labour should be thinking about it is that if you actually look at the vote shares, there is a progressive majority, in the country, which could lock the Conservatives out of government for the foreseeable future. So electoral reform should become a live issue under this government because, it's just not working for most voters, this electoral system. And that's what we can see with these wild swings from 2019 to now.
Henry, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I think, first of all, as I said before, if I was a Labour strategist today, I would not be thinking about electoral reform. I would think the system's just delivered us an incredible mandate. But I take Fran's wider point, although I fundamentally disagree with it. I think one of the best things about our system in Britain is we have removal truck politics. The first past the post system that you were describing a second ago creates quite large changes through elections. And it means that typically, it was quite unusual to have coalition politics. Now, some countries like coalition politics, but I think coalition politics leads to sort of behind-the-scenes horse trading on different policies. And it gives it's unclear to voters what they're really getting. And it can also empower minority interests, as we've seen in many of the elections recently on the continent. And you can end up with extremists on either the far left of politics or the far right, constantly having to be brought into government. I don't think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that broadly the two main parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative parties, are both actually have their own coalitions internally. The Labour Party stretches all the way from Diane Abbott across through to Blairites like Wes Streeting. The Conservative Party similarly stretches from One Nation Tories all the way through to the ERG, which is their sort of.
But Henry, sorry, just to interrupt. I mean, hasn't that been the Conservative Party's Achilles heel here? I mean, who can now unite what is an incredibly polarised party? I mean, are the Conservatives, as we know them, toast?
No, I don't think so. I think the Conservative Party will have to change and will have to reflect very carefully on this election result. And I think it's that will inevitably need to be a period of rebuilding. I don't think it's predetermined that there has to be an enormous internal bloodletting, which has happened after previous defeats, but I could certainly foresee that happening. But just to finish on the electoral system, one criticism that's often made of the UK system is that there are too many safe seats where your vote doesn't count. I think last night and this morning, we've just seen that isn't true. We've seen supposedly safe seats like the seat of the former Prime Minister Liz Truss in Norfolk, where she lost. And the electorate rejected her. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about our system. When you go to cast your vote in the ballot box at the polling station on a Thursday, as it always is in Britain, you know that you're voting for a specific MP in your constituency. Constituencies are relatively small areas. There's 650 of them across the UK. And the MP gets to know the area pretty well. And if they're a good MP, should know a lot of their electorate. I just don't think that's the case in countries with proportional systems. And I'd finally say that we had a referendum on changing our voting system in 2012, and it was decisively defeated.
OK, Henry, thanks for that. In the last few moments of this discussion, let's talk about another story of the night. Of course, as we've been saying, the overall picture when it comes to a Labour win probably couldn't be any clearer, but something is hiding in the results here, isn't it? Namely, the Reform Party, led by the architect of Brexit, the right-wing nationalist politician, Nigel Farage. I mean, only a couple of years ago, I mean, the prediction was that they wouldn't feature at all in any forthcoming election, but they've come second in a staggering 98 seats. Leon, Britain's democracy appeared at least to be coalescing around a single party, but the figures suggest something else is happening, a deep fracturing in British politics.
Yeah, call it a fracturing, call it a fragmentation, but we are certainly entering a period of British politics where there are more than two parties who you can choose from. And for the Conservatives, one of their big reasons for this defeat was they were outflanked on the right by Nigel Farage's Reform Party. And the Conservative line throughout this election was that if you vote Reform, you will end up getting Labour. And I have to say, that's come true in so many of these seats where Reform have finished second, because they have taken away a number of votes from Conservative candidates and effectively created a space for Labour to walk through. So, yeah, there is a fragmentation of politics, but it's not just Reform that have done very well. It's been a fantastic night for the Liberal Democrats as well. It's been a good night for the Greens. And we've also had a smattering of independents also pick up seats. So there is a fragmentation of UK politics. And I think for both Labour and the Conservatives, they have to look at their vote share. They have to look at the type of people and the type of demographic who are voting for them and wonder how they can shore up that vote in light of this fragmentation. And I think that is something that has changed in British politics in recent years, probably post-Brexit, where we before that period, it was a case of it's Labour or the Tories, and there's not much going on beyond that. I think we have seen a fragmentation of British politics, and maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Just picking up, Leon, what you talked about, fragmentation there, the fracturing of British politics. Fran, we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to address, you already mentioned it a little bit earlier on in the show, what happened in Scotland. The Scottish Nationalist Party have been punished. What does that say to you, very briefly, about the appetite for Scottish independence?
I mean, on Scotland, yeah, it's a really, obviously, pretty disappointing night for SNP. They've obviously been in turmoil the last couple of years. I mean, in terms of what it means for Scottish independence, I think, again, can Labour deliver on living standards, on people's standard of living, and deliver for the people of Scotland? If they don't, then, you know, there may be a resurgence of the SNP. But yeah, for now, I mean, in terms of what the polling is looking like on independence, it's not the top priority, as with the many issues. What is people's standards of living, getting investments, better public services. And I think, you know, as we know, it was a huge rejection of the Conservatives in Scotland, as it was across the country, and that definitely played into Labour's gains. So I think the picture, you know, isn't totally clear that Scottish independence is off the table, you know, for the foreseeable future. But I think for the time being, at least in Westminster politics, the SNP are hugely weakened. And so it will be how they take that loss and how they kind of decide to respond to it. And obviously in the Scottish parliamentary elections next year, I think.
All right, Fran, many thanks for that. However way you rotate this, Britain's political landscape is very much changing. It sounds like at the end of the day, it is the grassroots issue that is at the forefront of voters' minds. Fran, Boait, Henry Newman, Leon Emirali, great to have you on Inside Story. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Neave Barker, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.